I'm James Swanwick. This is the Alcohol Free Lifestyle Podcast, where you learn to live a life of health, wealth, love, and happiness.
Have you ever craved alcohol? It's likely, if you're listening to this podcast, that cravings are one of the biggest inhibitors of your ability to stop drinking. Cravings can be extremely uncomfortable. Sometimes when we're experiencing a craving for alcohol, it's all we can think about. It can be totally consuming. And it can give us a feeling of desperation, feeling like we're out of control, that we have no ability to exert our will, and we find ourselves almost automatically going to the drinks cabinet, ordering a drink that we promised ourselves we wouldn't, or staring at a bottle, having that inner battle whether we should or we shouldn't. Cravings take up a huge amount of mental energy. They're exhausting. They can get us really down. And we can spend a lot of time just wishing that we wouldn't have them, that they would just go away. In this episode, I'm going to talk about cravings. Why do we have this all-encompassing desire to do something that intellectually we know is bad for us? That in our hearts and in our minds we really don't want to do. But there's something that we're not sure what it is, but there's something that's driving us, that's urging us to take action against everything that we feel that we want to do in that moment. It's confusing. It can get us to feel really down on ourselves, and it can sometimes lead to us giving up because we feel that that craving is stronger than us. That's a pretty dark place that we can get to when we're trying to quit alcohol. My name is Sarah Connelly, and I'm a coach in the Alcohol Free Lifestyle program. My goal for this podcast today is to share with you where these cravings start, to look at the whole story. And so to make it hopefully a bit more easy to understand, I'm going to share with you how it worked for me and how I ended up getting to a place where I felt like I couldn't stop drinking. The root of that inability to stop drinking is the craving that overcomes us in the moment, even though we know that we don't want to drink anymore. There's science behind this, there's psychology, there's spirituality, and there's the biological genetic component of why certain people end up finding themselves in a position where it's much harder to stop drinking than others. And to frame the overall message of this episode, I want to start with a brief quote from Buddhist psychologist Tara Brach. She says, "I think of our attachments and addictions when they are very strong and locked in as a flag that we have left home. It's a flag that our attention's energies are fixated outside of ourselves, and we've been pulled away from our own awareness and our own heart. If we can really pay deep attention to where we are most stuck or hooked, then that very place actually becomes a portal to a profound transformation and freedom. That is the promise." So the invitation for this episode is to accept, first and foremost, that cravings are part of our journey. They are part of life. We don't just crave alcohol, we crave love, we crave connection, we crave donuts, we crave a lot of things. But what does a craving actually mean? As I've learnt and grown through my own experience, when I crave something outside of myself, it's not so much alcohol anymore, it's other things to distract my attention. It is based on a discomfort inside. I'm feeling uncomfortable inside, and so I want something from the outside to come in and comfort me. As we go through the extraordinary journey of growth when we remove alcohol, we start to learn why we feel this discomfort, and more importantly, we start to learn how we can soothe ourselves, how we can get what it is that we need without resorting to what we now consider, or I now consider, a very low quality option. Alcohol is simply a low quality option of dealing with our internal discomfort. So let's take a look at how this played out for me. But first, I just want to add in that it's not your fault if you are in a position where you are feeling out of control with your alcohol consumption. Nobody wants to be addicted. Nobody wants to act compulsively. Unfortunately, society has communicated very successfully that if you cannot control this substance, you are somehow morally failing. And this translates in human beings as a sense that we are bad, that we are weak, that we should be able to control ourselves, and that we should have enough willpower to stop. The fact is, we can't and we don't. Alcohol, as you may know by now, is a highly addictive substance. It hijacks key reward brain circuitry. It changes the way that the brain works. And over time, unbeknownst to the drinker, it starts to rewire key brain circuitry so that eventually the brain takes over in the belief that alcohol is necessary, a necessary part of our life in order for us to survive. This is not something that we get signposts for. It's not something we're educated about. So please, wherever you are in your journey, remember that it is not your fault. It's a whole host of reasons that have ended up where you have ended up in this position. And there's no discrimination. People that come through the programs that I work in are from all walks of life. So at the beginning of your journey through this episode, should you choose to stick with me, I really hope that you understand this most important part. It is not your fault. It is your responsibility, of course, to do something about it. But the reason that you're here is for so many factors that are beyond your control. So what are those factors? First of all, genetic predisposition. We don't have one alcohol gene, but there are multiple factors that contribute to whether or not when you consume alcohol or nicotine or any other drug, depending on your genetic history, you may get more pleasure from that substance than another person. If you get more pleasure, then you are more likely to become addicted. So we talk about high risk genes, high vulnerability, high sensitivity, high susceptibility. All of these things are hereditary. It doesn't mean you're doomed. It just means that you are more likely to gain pleasure from the substance than somebody that doesn't have that genetic predisposition. Obviously, as human beings, when we do something that we like, we want to repeat it. And this is what happens with alcohol and other drugs. So we have the genetic predisposition. We also, generally speaking, would have a psychological influence, particularly if we are brought up in a family where drugs and alcohol was consumed on a regular basis. The chances are that our environment was quite high stress, or at least medium stress, and that our parents perhaps weren't as present as they would have been were they not consuming drugs, alcohol, etc. So as a child, if we grow up in an environment where there is high levels of stress, again, we are much more likely to seek something outside of ourselves to soothe if we are not getting that from our primary caregivers. This again leaves us highly sensitive and vulnerable to substances. Most children that are living in stressful environments, if they are not exposed directly to drugs and alcohol, which hopefully they're not, sadly some of them are, people will tend to turn to food. That can be the primary addiction. Children will eat to soothe themselves, to relieve their boredom. I certainly relate to that. I ate a lot of donuts in my time. So we're highly sensitive to substances. We may be highly stressed based on our environment. And so we then go out into the world as a young person, and society tells us, here's a great thing that you can do. It's legal and everybody's doing it. And guess what? You'll feel great. So we look around us and we see celebrities and we see the parties and we see the glamorous advertising and of people consuming alcohol. And we think, well, that's great. We have a go, we go out with our friends, we have a couple of drinks, and suddenly, based on the last two things that I've shared with you, the predisposition, potentially a high stress, we take a drink and we feel a sense of relief. That sense of relief is what I'm referring to when I talk about we are in discomfort and then we look for something outside of ourselves to relieve that discomfort. Our first experience of that may be food. But as we get older and we're more open and available to the messaging around alcohol, that second substance tends to be, these days, alcohol. It used to be cigarettes when I was young. First time I had a cigarette, I felt such a high, such a relief that I was hooked from day one. So this is how this happens. This is the process. I'd like to just briefly mention as well that if we are not spiritually connected, which generally many of us aren't, we may be connected to a traditional religion with strict rules and dogmas where we're told not to feel a certain way and to feel a certain way, which has its own problems. But if we are not taught that everything that we need exists inside of us, which very few people are taught at a young age, we are constantly looking for a solution outside of ourselves. So to add a little bit more depth to what I'm talking about here, the interaction of your genes and your life experiences shapes the circuitry of your brain as you are growing up. And the most important influence on all of that is that we are critically influenced by the responsiveness of the adults around us, particularly in the early childhood years. This comes from the work of addiction specialist Gabor Mate, and he says that the most important influence on physiological development on the child's brain is the quality of the adult-child relationship and the mutual responsiveness of that relationship. So it's the experiences that we have as children, along with our genetic predisposition, that shapes the brain circuitry. So when people talk about addiction or mental health issues being inherited, it's not directly inherited. It's what we call epigenetics. It's a combination of your environment and your genetics. So what is inherited is your sensitivity, and that is what leads to us starting to crave something external that's going to relieve the internal discomfort.
Hi, I'm James Swanwick. Have you downloaded my free Alcohol Freedom Formula yet? If not, you can go to alcoholfreelifestyle.com/guide. You can download it. It will outline the same process that we walk our clients through in our flagship 90-day stop drinking program. You'll also get an email from me each day with tips and tricks to reduce or stop drinking, to improve your health, nutrition, mobility, and lots of other great mindset techniques. That's alcoholfreelifestyle.com/guide.
So, the story of craving and addiction starts often long before we pick up a drink or a drug. It starts when we enlist the support of something to help us feel better when we feel uncomfortable. In an ideal world, as children, we would get that support from our parents. But as I've already mentioned, our parents are dealing with their own stuff from their parents and their parents. So oftentimes we don't get the support that we are looking for, so we might go and raid the pantry in the early days. Because we're wired to have that sense of safety and comfort, it's practically impossible for us to learn how to do this on our own if we're not taught to. And as we live in the societies I've mentioned, where it's all about you can get this feeling from buying our product, whether it's food or alcohol or cigarettes or vapes or whatever, that's what we go to because that's where our attention is naturally drawn. They catch our attention and they tell us how they can solve our problem. So let's keep going with this idea that when we have this deficiency, we have a deficiency or a sense that something is missing, we are left with what we might call a feeling of emptiness or a feeling of deficiency. We also might be feeling a sense of fear about that deficiency. So an overall feeling of discomfort becomes the norm. And the only time that we can really feel some peace from these feelings of discomfort is when we are consuming the cigarette or the alcohol or the food. And we get those brief moments where we feel this sense of, people talk about this a lot. You know, I drink to just calm myself down, to relax, to shut up the noise, to relieve discomfort. And as we've seen so far, that discomfort is an accumulation of so many things over many, many years. So the soil for craving is the interaction of your genes and your environment, the outlook and temperament that you grew up within from in your family. Maybe it was quite a negative environment. Maybe it was an environment which was promoting of suppressing certain emotions. We have the influence of alcohol or other drug dependency within the family. Mental disorders that have also potentially been running through families. The influence of society, which is huge. Let us help you. We have a product. You can buy it. Everybody's doing it and it will make you feel better. Yes, please, I'll have some of that. So let me share with you how this played out for me. I grew up in a very highly stressed environment. I wasn't beaten up. I wasn't abused in any severe way, but I was brought up in a house where there was a lot of anger and unpredictable behaviour. I was highly sensitive to needing a form of relief, a form of escape, which was, now I know, inherited that sensitivity from my father's side. And so I've had a lot of stress. It was building up in my body. I started to live in fight-flight mode because I was uncomfortable all of the time. I would relieve that unconscious distress with food. And I was in primal mode, just trying to survive, to get through the day, to deal with my unpredictable, unsafe environment. So over the years, I became conditioned to reaching for food to soothe. And it worked. And when you're young, At least for me, I was pretty lucky. I could eat pretty much whatever I liked without putting a huge amount of weight on. But what my system learned was that in order to stay safe, I needed to be prepared and I needed to have a way of escaping. And my anxious calm became the norm for me. And I lived many, many years in a state of high arousal, feeling uncomfortable. And I didn't know. In fact, it wasn't until relatively recently that I realized just how much of my life was spent in this fight-flight mode, just feeling constantly alert and prepared for danger. So once I started to socialize at about the age of 15, I would be able to escape this environment and meet some friends. And of course, with friends came cigarettes and alcohol. And so my brain started to make new neural connections. Used to be food and relief, and then it became alcohol, cigarettes, friends, and relief. And so every time that I felt stressed and anxious, the solution, my brain would say, okay, this is what you do. You call your friend, you go out, you have a pack of cigarettes and you drink a bottle of wine. It wasn't quite that extreme at the age of 15, but you get the picture. And this pathway of behavior became very ingrained in me emotionally, physiologically, psychologically. And this pathway, neural pathway, became my preferred method of stress relief. It was the only thing that I knew. And back then, nobody was talking about meditation or yoga or any of those other things that we talk about now. I was conditioned from a very young age that the way to relieve my stress and anxiety was to use alcohol in a friendship environment. Now, how this relates to cravings is pretty simple. As I mentioned before, it is the feeling of discomfort, a feeling of stress, anxiety, whatever it is, a feeling that does not feel good in the body. And so the body says, what can I do about this? I know for 10, 20, 30 years, however long it is you've been drinking, the brain will say to you, this is going to make the difference. This is going to calm you down. And at a very deep unconscious level, what the brain is saying is, in a craving moment, something is very, very wrong here. You are under threat. Your survival is under attack. And in order to get rid of that horrible feeling of fear, this is what you need to do. You need to have a drink. So, whilst cravings, people might talk about them as something that you just sit through it, just deal with the craving. Yes, that's exactly what we must do. But what I want to highlight in this episode is that it's not just a surface level desire. It is a very deep-seated response, or it can be very deep-seated physiological, psychological response to your primitive brain saying, help, there's something really wrong here. We must escape. We must do the thing that we know is going to bring relief. Now, as you most likely know, the relief comes in the form of that surge of chemicals. One of them, neurotransmitter dopamine, is talked about very often in this context, that you get this surge of feel-good chemicals that provide the momentary relief that you are seeking. And what that does, of course, is reinforce the belief in your system that this is the way to solve the problem. And a key point here to remember is that when your body is responding to what it perceives as a real threat, the threat of danger to your survival, then its ability to think long-term and rationally is severely impaired, if not completely impossible. The part of the brain that is active in these moments where the cravings seems so impossible to overcome is the same part of the brain that kicks in when you're being chased by a deadly animal. It's not rational. It doesn't have time to stop and think things through. Once you are in that hyper arousal state, it is very, very, very hard for you to talk yourself off the ledge. That is what is a very powerful, powerful physiological response to fear, to danger, to threat. And your neural pathways conditioned for many, many years for using alcohol in order to relieve that feeling is what happens when you are in one of those almost impossible to escape from cravings. So as we become more familiar with this process, our system becomes familiar with it. We feel stressed, we feel anxious, we know what to do. We decide we're going to catch up with friends, and the dopamine, the neurotransmitter, which is our reward-seeking and memory neurotransmitter, starts to flow because we are anticipating the good feelings that we're going to get when we have a drink. So how does this relate to craving? Well, cravings will often start long before we've actually reached the point at which the drink is in front of us. You might notice in your life that you can start to crave when you're not really sure why. And it may just be as simple as you've completed a task at work, like you've achieved a goal that you've been trying to achieve. And your go-to in that response, in that moment, is to reward yourself. Historically, that feeling of accomplishment, which does also release a little bit of dopamine, is combined with the physiological response to that dopamine, which is okay, dopamine equals drinking, and now I know what I need to do. It all happens at a very physiological level, and your ability to intervene and to stop this process is totally dependent on how much time you will spend working on the part of the brain that can intervene and stop this process. So how do we do that? And how do we minimize the intensity of these cravings? It's important to know, of course, that with any habit change, any behavioral change, we must apply realism and patience. You are not going to eradicate alcohol cravings overnight. And you are not going to never crave alcohol again, even when you've removed alcohol for significant periods of time. This is why cravings can catch people off guard. They do 3 months and they're focused and they're doing the work, and then something happens in their environment, something that perhaps they weren't anticipating, that triggers this whole process that I've just described. A discomfort arises in the body, one that perhaps they haven't had for 3 months or 4 months because they've been doing all this work, but it arises, and because these neural pathways are so ingrained from such a young age, they go into autopilot. A bit like when you're driving to work on a Saturday, you're just completely offline and you go into this automatic response behavioural path. You find yourself confused. Why am I craving? What's going on? I've been doing so well. I thought I'd got this. I thought I'd conquered it. Once you hook into that thought pathway, where you start to feel like, oh my goodness, maybe I can't do it. I'm failing. I shouldn't be feeling this way. This is where the work really begins. This is the point where people get tripped up. Because I don't know about you, but I would be able to give up for certain periods of time, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, a couple of months here and there. And I just feel like this is great. I'm not craving alcohol. I feel really good. And then a craving would come along, and because I didn't understand it, I would automatically go into negative thinking. Oh my goodness, there's something wrong here. I haven't done the work. I need to do more. I'm a bad person. I'm never, la 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 la, all that noise and mental chatter, which creates what in the body? It creates stress and anxiety. And when we, historically, as we've seen through what I've shared with you, when we feel stressed and anxious, when we feel uncomfortable, it makes us want to escape. It makes us want to drink. So once we go down the rabbit hole of negative thinking, the amygdala, the fear center, the fight, flight, primitive part of the brain fires up and tells us something's very, very wrong. And once we get into that process, it's incredibly hard to pull ourselves back. So cravings, they are highly unpredictable in terms of when, where, and how extreme they are going to be, especially in the first year. Because if you think about the number of things that happen in a year that you've used alcohol to cope with, you have to get past all of those things at least once in order to build up your ability to intervene this highly powerful process. You need to, over time, develop the part of your brain that is educated, that understands what's going on, that can step back and say, I see this now. I'm uncomfortable in this situation. My body thinks that I'm in trouble. I'm in danger. It's telling me to do something, because if I don't do something, something really bad is going to happen to me. And historically, what I've done is I've had a drink, and it has relieved this feeling, albeit short term. It's important to also remember that when we are in this fight, flight, reactive frame of mind, we do not think about the consequences. The brain does not go, but hang on a minute, you're going to feel terrible tomorrow. It doesn't do that. Not until we start to train ourselves to understand firstly what's going on. We find ourselves in a craving, and it's talked about in a very visual, I like the visual of it, of the wave, and we call it the urge surfing. So the urge to drink comes up just like a wave, and you feel it. You can feel it in your body. Your mind starts to get busy. You feel very uncomfortable, and your primitive brain is like there's this red light flashing. Danger, danger, danger. And all the systems that we have ingrained, the neural pathways for 20, 30, 40 years of drinking, want to direct us down that path to pick up a drink. This is the time where we need to intervene with the tools, the skills, and the desire, the deep desire to change our behavior, to pause, understand what's happening, tell ourselves, I get it, but I'm not going to die if I don't drink. My life is not in danger. I can pause, I can wait, I can allow this very natural process to play out without giving this process what it historically wants, which is alcohol. And the more times that we don't give in to this urge, to this primitive drive, the more times we create a new memory in our neural pathways, a new memory that it is possible for us to survive without drinking. Now, it's important to give ourselves a lot of patience with this, and to understand that this process is not something that happened once and then we were hooked for the rest of our adult lives. We repeated the process. We felt stressed or anxious or celebratory or whatever it is for you. And in order to amplify that feeling or numb the feeling, we drank. We created a pattern of behavior that has been ingrained for many, many, many years. So when you find yourself in craving, all it is your natural response to a situation. Your normal response over a long period of time kicks in, and you have the ability now, with your understanding, to notice that that is what's going on, but not to get caught up and carried away in it. To say calmly to yourself, I see what's happening here, and I know that in the past I have given you the relief that you are seeking. I'm not going to provide that in the same way. I'm going to find a higher quality way. And our work is to surf through those urges. And sometimes those waves are pretty big and pretty scary. But at the root of it, to know that the only reason that they are so uncomfortable is because of a certain belief system that has been ingrained in our brain, which is we cannot possibly get through this without a drink. We cannot survive. Prove to yourself over and over and over again that you can by not drinking, and your cravings will get less intense over time. But remember also that out of the blue cravings will show up based on past ingrained behavior, based on certain things that are going to happen during the course of your life. Things that are going to cause you to feel uncomfortable. Things that are going to make you feel stressed, or things that are going to come up and say, this is not exciting enough. You need something to make this more exciting. And those old neural pathways will kick in, and you will find yourself with cravings even 6-12 months after you've quit alcohol. But by this point, you are onto it. The gig is up. You now have the knowledge and the ability to step back and observe what's going on instead of getting totally caught up and carried away in it. There are many tools that we use in order to handle these cravings, these times of craving. There are urge surfing meditations that you can find. You just Google urge surfing and there'll be hundreds of people that will have provided you with meditations that can help you. There is breathing exercises. There are so many different options for slowing down, becoming more present, and not getting caught up in these old automatic behaviors. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain which overrides the primitive brain, the one that says, okay, this is a craving, I know what it is, I understand what it is, I'm not going to allow it to carry me away. The prefrontal cortex is what we call I call the Yoda brain. Its ability to do that is highly enhanced by practices of mindfulness and meditation. This is where we learn our own deep power. This is where we learn to access the part of ourselves that does not get carried away by the naughty monkey mind the primitive brain, the one that wants it now and stamps its feet if it doesn't get it, the toddler. The prefrontal cortex is the part of us, the grown-up, the adult part, that says, okay, I hear you, I'm just not going to give you what you want because there are consequences. There are consequences to this behavior that I choose not to deal with. I don't want those consequences anymore. So, yes, a craving is uncomfortable. But it's not just as simple as I want this and I can't have it. There is a lot that goes into the creation of that process of craving. We have our genetics, we have our psychology, we have society pulling on our attention, telling us that it has the answers to our problems, and we have a disconnect between the deepest part of us that knows what's right for us and the other self, the facade, the one that wants what it wants and gives itself what it wants and is reactive and out of control. That disconnect is where I believe the deepest work needs to be done. We need to learn to parent ourselves. We need to learn to acknowledge and respect the process, to know that there are parts of it that we have very little control over, and we focus our attention and our energy on the parts that we can control. So to close this episode, I'm going to share with you a couple of my favorite tools for dealing with cravings. As you can probably tell, I like to have a lot of information and a lot of knowledge about why things are happening. And one of the things that I found really helpful in the early days was to stop and have a conversation with myself about what was happening. A craving would come up and I'd just say to myself, oh, here we go. Here's one of those mad, crazy cravings driven by my primitive brain. I am just going to sit back and let this play out. I am not going to get involved. I found that quite helpful as a tool and actually was able to do it with a bit of a sense of humor once I got more proficient at it. Another really simple tool is to take your hand and press your thumb to your first, second, third, and fourth finger as you say, I am here now. I am here now. What that will do is it will remove the intensity of the feeling that you are out of control, that you are being carried away into the fear zone, and it will bring you into the present moment and remind you who's in charge. I am here now. That means I am in control. I am not allowing these primitive brain systems to carry me away. Also, very simple breathing will calm the nervous system, which is what gets dysregulated when we're in craving. We're in this kind of, help, I need a drink, I need to do something. To take some long, deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. Ideally, your exhale will be longer than your inhale. But I think the most important thing to really acknowledge for yourself is that cravings are very, very uncomfortable for all the reasons that I've shared with you in this episode. Cravings are not fun. They are painful and they are hard to sit through. But I refer back to what I read right at the beginning of this episode, that it is those things, those pains, those discomforts, which allow us to, if we really pay attention, to notice what is going on in this moment that makes me feel so uncomfortable. When we drink, we avoid and we numb and we distract. So we don't get the message that we are being given by our system that there is something that we need to address. We are missing the most important part of what our body is trying to tell us, that there is something that is making us uncomfortable. And oftentimes, when we get more proficient at this, we'll start to see that those things that are making us uncomfortable are pretty innocuous. Our brain has gone into catastrophizing because that's what it's used to doing, and it's also used to getting immediate relief. But as we grow, we become more connected to ourselves, we start to see that the things that we are afraid of, the things that are causing us discomfort, and the reason why we are drinking, are things that may have bothered us when we were 7 or 8 years old. But as a grown-up, we now have the tools to really handle it if we can just get past that initial automatic reactivity that has come from years of conditioning and old behavioural patterns that we have just reinforced unconsciously over many, many years. So just as a reminder of that reading, just the last part, if we can really pay deep attention to where we are most stuck or hooked, then that very place actually becomes a portal to a very profound transformation and freedom. So next time a craving comes up, if you're really committed to this path, this alcohol-free lifestyle, I invite you to stop and pay attention, first of all, to the fact that this is an opportunity. Don't be afraid. It's nothing to be afraid of. There's an opportunity here in this moment to learn something about yourself. If you like, you can try the tool I mentioned earlier of just having a conversation. Wow, this is a tough moment. This is a moment of craving. This hurts. This is painful. Everything in me wants to pick up a drink. And now I'm educated. I understand why. It has nothing to do with me being a weak-willed person. It has to do with 20, 30 years of conditioned behavior. You might, at that point, start some deep breathing and making sure that that conversation in your head is positive and reinforcing instead of condemning yourself for having this craving. Because as we've already talked about, it's nothing to do with you. It's just old systems firing up based on external cues and internal cues, internal feelings. And so you get through, you ride the wave. You, most importantly, congratulate yourself once the wave has passed, and people will tell you cravings will last up to 20, possibly 30 minutes. I think it's dangerous to set a timer because, again, if it lasts a bit longer, then we tell ourselves stories that something's wrong. Just know that it will pass and that your job is just to remain present, to give yourself the honour of listening to what is really going on, to honour yourself enough to be grateful for the opportunity to learn something about yourself, to develop a new skill, to grow your resilience, to grow your sense of self-respect. And at all times, keeping that voice supportive, kind, compassionate. The part of you that is in craving, is afraid, is feeling under threat. So your job is to be the grown-up, the one that is saying it's all going to be okay. If you repeat this over and over again, whenever the cravings arise, not only will you see that the cravings are less frequent and less intense, but you will be learning a skill that you can then apply to all sorts of different areas of your life where you have historically been reactive to your environment. You will learn the skill of responsiveness, of being able to step back, to assess with clarity, and then to make informed, conscious decisions from the part of you that has been ignored potentially for many, many years. You will start to realize that there is a whole nother realm or plane on which you can operate in your life that is driven by your highest self, your best self. And those primitive urges that come from the lower self, the self that was perhaps mistreated as a child in some way, shape or form, that has now passed, that you are no longer there, that you are now at a stage in your life where you are ready to learn, grow and thrive. Thank you for listening. If you've got this far, I commend you. This was a reasonably long podcast, and encourage you to have a sense of humour, have a bit of playfulness, and know that every time you feel uncomfortable, it's just a sign that you are growing. It's a good sign, as long as you stay with yourself and don't get carried away with the cravings. This is Sarah Connelly for the Alcohol Free Lifestyle Podcast.